If you're ever confused on where to path in the early game, this video is going to be for you. In this video, I'm going to be talking about 7 different things that you want to consider to determine which way you should be pathing. Of course, not all of them are as important as the others, so I'll go into that later in the video. And in the last segment of the video, I'll have some examples so you can see how you would put it into practice in a real game instead of just in theory. The most important thing to think about whenever you're deciding whether you should path up or down is your individual champion's strengths and weaknesses. For example, does your champion do primarily AoE damage or single target? If your champion does AoE, then you're going to love ganking bot lane because you're going to be able to do more damage onto multiple people. But if your champion only does single target, it's not going to be as good to go bot lane because you're only hitting one person at a time. Not to say that you can't gank bot lane, but it's something to consider. And of course, the opposite is true. If your champion does primarily AoE damage, it's not going to be as good to gank top lane or mid lane because you're only hitting one target, so you're not going to be maximizing your damage. Along that same line of thought of AoE versus single target, you got to consider that for camps as well. Most champions, their clear speed is going to be fast enough to where it's not that big of a deal, but if your champion has a particularly slow clear, then maybe you need to do blue side to speed it up, whatever your champion does a clear faster on. Or if your champion really likes to do level 3 ganks, or you just think it's good for this particular game, maybe you want to consider starting red side because that'll make your gank much stronger. Is your champion the type that wants to farm to 6 quickly or look for early fights? If you're looking for early fights, then you probably want to path the same way as the enemy jungler if you know where they're starting, but if you want to avoid fights, maybe you want to path the other way. After considering these, you still want to think about whatever lane you're ganking, is it going to be ranged champions or melee champions? A very popular pick recently in the jungle is Darius. While he has been nerfed, some people are still playing him, and it's a pretty good way to think of it. Darius is the type of champion that does really well into melee champions because he can get onto them and stack up his passive. But playing against ranged champions is a little bit harder for Darius until he gets his items because he's not very mobile. So they're going to kite him and then he's not really going to get the value that he's looking for. But maybe your champion is good into ranged champions because you have a dash that's good at locking them down, but you don't have quite enough damage to chew through a melee champion. The second thing to consider is, do your teammates provide good gank setup? Do they have CC? Do they have enough damage? You're usually going to be looking for whatever your champion is lacking. If your champion is high CC, then you'll probably need an ally that does a lot of damage. But if your champion is primarily damage and has almost no CC, such as a Graves or Master Yi, then maybe you need something like a Renekton on your team or a Syndra that can set you up easily. Of course, sometimes you don't have to worry about this. Maybe your champion has both, or your teammate has both, just because they're designed to be really strong in the early game, and that's great. Not only do you want to consider what your ally has, you also want to consider what does the enemy have. Does your enemy have any form of escapes? Almost everybody's going to have flash, but do they also have something like Lucian E, Camille E, any kind of way to avoid the gank? If they do, then you're either going to need really good CC to stop it from happening, or you need to wait until they burn it before you go in for the gank. The third thing to consider is volatility. How vulnerable are the laners going to be? Are they playing champions that are really safe, like Sion versus Ornn? They're not really fighting that much, and even if they do, they're not losing a ton of HP. You're not going to care about that lane that much. However, if we change the variables and you have something like a Sylas versus Irelia in the mid lane, or Fiora versus Camille in the top lane, there's going to be a lot more fighting going on, and people are going to be lower HP. Those kind of lanes you generally want to be playing around because it's going to be a lot easier to impact that lane. They're going to be much lower HP. Once they go in, it's harder for them to get out. And again, that is assuming that they have burned their dash that would allow them to get out. In the case of stuff like Yasuo and Irelia, usually they don't have a way out because they're having to dash to enemy minions. But if you're playing against something like a Shen, he could E in and then he's really vulnerable, but if he doesn't use his E, he's not going to be killable. So you have to keep that in mind. How likely are they going to commit onto your ally? Another great example of this is Vayne top lane. And the reason is because Vayne's Q is terrible for escaping. Her passive is great for chasing people down because it gives her movement speed towards them, but when it comes to getting out, she's very weak. How much is the golden XP lead from the gank going to impact the matchup? If it's tanks or a very one-sided matchup, it might not be as beneficial for your ally. The fourth thing to consider is how strong is your champion in early fights when combined with your allies. Because yes, it's easy to think about, oh, I'm playing an early game champion so I want to fight, but you have to consider, is your teammate playing an early game champion that wants to fight? Or the opposite, are you playing a scaling champion that doesn't really want to fight that much, but you have really strong top and mid laners or really strong mid and bot laners that can help you win a fight even though you're weaker in the short term? It's really important to consider the 2v2, 3v3 if you end up pathing in the same way as the enemy jungle, or you have some kind of river fight. Number 5, lane priority. If you're not familiar with the term, that's whenever your teammates have push and they're able to move to fights without losing minions. People tend to mess up with this one in solo queue because they don't understand that it's not guaranteed to go as they expect. Sometimes they're wrong because they genuinely don't understand the matchup, or, as I said, it's solo queue. Things happen, not everything's going to go how you want it to or think it should, especially in lower elos. So when it comes to lane priority, it's good to think about, don't get me wrong, but you need to be willing to adapt if it doesn't turn out how you're expecting it to. So if you're wanting to fight over the top side scuttle from the beginning of the game, but then you realize around that time that your top laner doesn't have push like you expect them to, maybe you need to give it up. Take a reset or go to the bot side scuttle, depending on what is appropriate for the situation, and look for a better opportunity later, instead of forcing it because you think your top laner should have prio and then you end up dying, making everything so much worse. Number 6, enemy jungle pathing. This is one of the most overrated reasons for why people should path a certain way. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that it's not important to think about what the enemy jungler wants to do. It's also just a great exercise to figure out if you're doing the right things. Does it make sense? But the reason I say that a lot of junglers overvalue this is because they'll start doing things in order to quote unquote counter the enemy that are really bad for their own champion. All the stuff that I talked about before about your champion strengths and weaknesses, do your allies have gank setup, that kind of thing, those are going to be way more important because those are going to give you a positive outcome far more often than trying to counter the opposing jungler. But if you can do something that screws over the enemy jungler and doesn't put you behind in most cases, then that's just going to be an extra benefit that you can add on top. When it comes to enemy jungle pathing, the main thing to be concerned about is where the enemy jungler is likely going to gank and if they're going to invade you. If you think it's very likely they're going to invade you, then you can deal with this by warding, and maybe instead of going straight into the buff, you could try to do something like Raptor's Krug's buff, or if you're going into the blue side, you could do Wolf's Grant Blue, making sure that they're not going to kill you right as you go onto your buff. Because most of the time, that's where they're looking to invade you. The last thing to consider is win conditions. A lot of people like to talk about win conditions, and win conditions are important later in the game. But on your first clear, when you're deciding whether you want to path up or down, it's going to have very little impact on which way you should go. And the reason is because you don't know who's going to be strong yet. Right now, you're just trying to build a lead on whichever team member is the strongest right now. You get your lead, you get strong yourself, and then once you're strong, you can help whichever teammate's going to need the most help later on, so that you can snowball that lead. Whether it be for your Kayle top lane later on when she starts to scale up, or a Jinx, it doesn't really matter what champion it is. Whoever is going to be strong later, you can play for them later, but initially, play for whatever's going to be the best for you. Before I go into the examples, here's some quick things not to worry about when deciding whether you should path up or down. Win rates of your teammates, they don't matter. Don't even look at them before the game, just focus on what champions you have in the game, what they can do for you, what they can't do for you. Sure, maybe you'll have these edge cases where a particular teammate is really bad, they're boosted, whatever, and it doesn't turn out well. But if you spend all of your games focusing on what the champions themselves can do, then you're going to get a positive outcome in most cases. Don't worry about whether you're going to be playing for Drake or Grubs at the beginning of the game. That's something that you'll adjust to as the game goes on. You figure out who's stronger at the time, as well as what tempo you need to play around. Does your teammate need to reset? Is your teammate able to move? Is the enemy jungler on the other side of the map? There's a whole lot of different factors that will determine that, so don't worry about that when you're first starting the game. Worry about that when it's about 4 to 5 minutes in. For the first real game example, pretend you're the Xin Zhao in this game. This is going to be one of the best scenarios for a very clear way that you should path. The Xin Zhao has Draven Leona, one of the strongest early game bot lanes in the game, against Ahri Thresh. They're going to absolutely be stomping them early, and they win the 3v3 even if Viego decides to path that way. If the Viego decides to path the other way, he's forced to play into a tank v tank lane, so even if he gets a kill, it's not going to be nearly as impactful as Xin Zhao getting the Draven a kill. You also have great setup from Leona and Draven because they both have hard CC, so that makes it much easier to land Xin Zhao's W. Not to mention, if the play doesn't end up turning into any kind of kill, he's still going to have lane priority from bot lane so that he can fight for scuttle or look for any kind of plays without having to worry about dying to it. Well, let's say he does this clear and bot lane's not gankable for whatever reason, that's fine, he'll still very likely have lane priority from them, and so that gives him the opportunity to look for invades, fight over scuttle, whatever he wants to do. For this example, pretend that you're the Briar. If you path towards bot lane, it's probably not going to work out too well because your bot laners, they don't have any good gank setup. Yes, the bar does have his Q, which can in theory stun 2 targets, but realistically it's probably not going to happen. It's pretty hard to set up, and the enemy team has Alistar, which can very easily deal with Briar. All he has to do is W or Q, and she can't really do anything about it because she has to run into him in order to do damage. And I haven't even mentioned that Kai'Sa's E also makes it much harder to get onto her as well. So instead, you probably want to play towards the top side of the map, especially around Urgot and Jax, because they're going to be fighting a lot in melee range, and if Jax ever goes in, Urgot has great gank setup with his E. Makes it really easy for the Briar to follow up, and she's only having to hit one target, so she doesn't have to worry about missing out on damage when fighting an AoE situation. And she's only having to hit one target, which goes great with what I was talking about at the beginning of this video of champion strengths. While she does technically have AoE in her E, most of the time she'd prefer to focus on one target, especially in situations where landing a fully charged E is very unreliable. And if you'll notice, both Jax and Urgot have very early game runes. Urgot took PTA and Jax took Hail of Blades. You also have the potential to play for mid lane if Akali and Ahri get particularly low, but most likely Ahri's going to be playing pretty safe until she hits 6, so. In the last example, pretend you are Udyr. For some reason, all the games are red side, I don't know why, just happen to be that way. Either way, you're going to want to path towards bot lane this game. You have really good gank setup with Nautilus because he has his Q, he has his passive, there's a lot of CC to work with, but the Twitch also has exhaust. Not only that, there's a lot of gank setup in Sylas, so if you have red buff, you still have the option of ganking him, potentially level 3 if the Mel gets particularly low or is really overextended. I know that Udyr is not the type of champion that usually is going to deviate all full clear, but it is worth mentioning. Imagine if you were to path the other way and you were to path towards top lane. The Sion is very killable, however, he's still going to be able to pick up the wave after he dies, so it's not that impactful compared to going towards bot lane. You'd only end up pathing towards top if your support's playing an enchanter that's not really going to help that much in a gank, like maybe a Yuumi or a Soraka. Otherwise, it's really important that you play towards that lane because there's going to be a lot of fighting going on with 2 hook champs. It's very likely that Viego will also path down because he doesn't want to play towards a Sion versus Aatrox lane. Even if he were to somehow kill the Aatrox and get Sion a little bit of a lead, it's still going to be a really tough matchup for the Sion regardless.